All right. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Daniel. It's a real honor to be here and introducing the 2024 Bevan Series and kicking it off here. Yeah, as Daniel mentioned, I think I got here by failing to be the second most vocal member of the group of people proposing this idea. They were like, okay, well, you want to know about what success is in fishery management, you tell us. So first off, I'm an economist. I want to set your expectations here. And we know that if you take all the economists in the world and lay them end to end, you never reach a conclusion. So I'm not going to give you a cut and dry answer here today. And that's partly because the reason I was interested in this topic was it's something I think about a lot, and I don't know the answer. I want to learn from everything that we have today. So from everything that we're going to hear about this quarter. So the approach that I'm going to take today is a little bit more conveying some of the different perspectives that I am familiar with and sort of orienting you to some of the different notions of success that we talk about in fisheries and policy more generally. And that's going to set us up to ask some really good questions going forward. So that's kind of my goal. And I'm going to start in the most inductive way possible by conducting an audience participation poll. And as you know, or as many of you know, because they've taken Poll Everywhere away from us, we have to use different software. So I just want to throw this question open to you. What factors would you consider to determine whether a fishery is a management success? You can scan this QR code down here, or you can go to menti.com and enter 1300-503. Yes. Yeah. And we'll see what we get after a minute of thought here. Oh, we're storming. This is good. Okay. So let's look at what we have emerging in the center here. We've got a strong thought about sustainable and sustainability, and if we combine those two, it's like really big, right? So some notion of sustainable, there's a whole other seminar about what is sustainable and how do we define that, but that's good. We've got some notion of fish and productive and profitable. Equitable is important. We're going to talk a little bit about what equitable success looks like today. I see a lot about economic stability, happy fishers, social license. So things need to fit in with their communities in a variety of ways. Respecting tribal rights, human well-being. How do we get all this to fit together? All right. So part of what I've tried to do here is condense my study guide and my thoughts about what success means. There we go. And realize that success is defined around are defined by different people in a variety of ways. And many of us move among these ways of defining it in different contexts. So one way is that we talk about success is look at outcomes for biology. And one of the things that we saw on the word cloud was sustainable. And by that, we mean the target stock is sustainable and the ecosystem's healthy. Then we might expand to think not just about the environment, but also economic outcomes and community outcomes. And that's a sort of triple bottom line approach to defining success. And in certain contexts, we might be interested in using our fishery to alleviate poverty, provide resilience, provide a safety net for people who are particularly vulnerable. And there's a couple different approaches out there in the literature to think about this. A welfare approach where we think about the fishery as a subsistence source of food and an employer of last resort when other things go wrong for people. You can always go to the river and fish. Or we might think about using a fishery to build up wealth and as a component of a diverse local economy that is resilient. And then we think about the process that's used to make decisions for the fishery. And is that equitable? And as I talk about these different notions of success, I want to talk about how to measure status and progress. And I'm going to provide you with a couple examples. And try to reflect a little bit on what are the implications for how we do scientific work. All right. So let's start off with biological outcomes. At the most basic level, we might be focused on the stock of fish we are targeting. And we like our stock levels to be around maximum sustainable yield and our fishing mortality levels to be around the level that corresponds to maximum sustainable yield. Now, in the United States, we have a mandate under the Magnuson-Stevens Act here that's articulated in our National Standard 1. If you're not familiar with the Magnuson-Stevens Act, it is the primary piece of legislation that we use to manage federal fisheries here in the United States. And it is implemented through a series of 10 national standards. I'm going to call out a few of those, but not all of them during this talk. But National Standard 1 holds that the conservation and management measures shall prevent overfishing while achieving, on a continuing basis, the optimum yield from each fishery for the United States fishing industry. Okay? So this is how we sort of operationalize a notion of success. And this tells us something about what sustainability means. Why do we want to sustain our stocks? Seems an obvious question, but let's be clear. Usually our goal in managing a fishery is to provide for high sustained harvests. And most other fishery benefits rely on high levels of harvest being sustained. So, what do we look at to determine whether we're being successful? That is, how do we measure success? All right. And the way that we do this is with scientific stock assessments. Something you can come here at SAS to learn how to do. We do it relatively well as a group. Nationally, we have 355 assessed stocks with known overfishing status and 249 assessed stocks with known overfishing status. And this is NOAA Fisheries' annual report to Congress on the status of the stocks, right? So this is how the people responsible for managing our fisheries report to Congress, right, our representatives of the public, to say whether or not they're being successful. And we see that over time, we have fairly high levels of stocks that we are not actively overfishing, which is the sort of teal bars, and the navy blue bars are the stocks that are not overfished, which means we have not depleted them in one way or another. And we are in the 85 to 90% range on both those measures. Right? And we can look at where we are overfishing. This is part of the same report to Congress. And here you can look to see up in the North Pacific. I'm going to provide some specific examples from the North Pacific. So I want you to pay particular attention there that the only overfishing species in the North Pacific are, as of this year, crab. And we're going to ask some other questions about that as we go on. But this is how we monitor our success. We keep track of the fish species and the fish populations where we are not attaining some level of sustainability. And globally, we can do the same thing. And we can draw on a project Ray has been a very significant contributor to, where that is sort of represented in the RAM Legacy project at ramlegacy.org here. And it shows us for each country how much of the catch is assessed, and it contains basic information on the assessments and the status of those assessments, so that we can study those. So what we can see here is that throughout most of the US, Europe, some of South America, parts of Africa, and a little bit of Japan, we have good representation of how well we are doing, and that in Asia, broadly speaking, we know a lot less. We're doing a less good job of monitoring how well we are doing. And thus we don't know how successful we are on this metric. And if we look at those stocks where we are monitoring whether we're successful, we can ask ourselves whether or not we are being successful. And many of us are familiar with this plot, but if you are not, on the x-axis here, we have the relative biomass, the comparison to BMSY. So our target here is 1. And if we're at 1 or higher, we think that we have a biomass of fish in the water that exceeds, meets or exceeds that corresponding to MSY. And on the y-axis here, we have the fishing mortality or amount of fishing pressure relative to MSY. And if we are below that, we are not actively overfishing. And if we are above that, we are putting more pressure on the fishery than is consistent with sustaining BMSY over the long term. And what we see here is that a lot of the stocks about which we know status, we have either high biomass or slightly lower biomass, but also lower fishing pressure. So these stocks we would expect to be recovering. So this presents us with some sense of how we're doing with on our biological outcomes. But biological outcomes also have another dimension, a broader ecosystem impact, where we're looking beyond the health of the individual stock. And here we appeal to National Standard 9, or we're given guidance by National Standard 9, which says that conservation and management measures shall, to the extent practicable, minimize bycatch, and to the extent that bycatch can't be avoided, minimize the mortality of such bycatch. So this national standard refers specifically to one particular way in which fishing impacts non-target species, bycatch. But ecosystem impacts can be broader than that. If the joint harvest of non-target species, that's bycatch. We can also talk about habitat impacts. The act of fishing changes the habitat. Trophic or food web habitat impacts, where we are pulling out fish that might be an important
source of food for other species, and interactions with prohibited species like marine mammals, turtles, sharks. How we measure these depends greatly on the individual impact that we're looking at. So it's important, I wanted to call this out as a notion of management success, but not dwell on it too much. Now, as we go through the different notions of success, I want to get you thinking about a particular example. And I know that we're all familiar with individual fisheries. I'm going to throw up one that is particularly easy for me and near and dear to many of you. The Bering Sea Aleutian Islands groundfish fishery management plan, and asked you to, at several points in this talk, sort of engage in the exercise of whether you think this is a management success. Okay, so I'm going to provide you some key facts, a little bit of background, and sort of challenge notions of success. Right. So, what do we need to know about this fishery in order to answer these questions? First, the groundfish fishery management plan is developed and refined by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. We harvest about 1.9 million metric tons of fish per year. That's a lot. And it's worth $800 million to $1 billion a year in ex-vessel value. About 2/3 of what we harvest is pollock, one species. Pacific cod and flatfish constitute most of the rest of that. What fleets do we talk about? We have both industrial and sort of small boat fleets. The industrial fleet is dominated by pollock midwater trawling. We have a non-pollock bottom trawl, or Amendment 80 fleet, which catches groundfish, including Pacific cod, flatfish, and a number of other species, and an industrial longline fleet, which targets primarily Pacific cod and sablefish. We have small boat fleets that use long lines, jigs, pots, and a variety of other species. I have crossed out halibut here. Halibut is economically important to some of these fleets. It is not managed under this groundfish FMP. It is managed separately by an international treaty. Okay. The large fleets have individual quota programs and cooperatives that they've set up. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go on. Small boat fleets have TAC allocations and some flexibility, sort of collective TAC allocations. All the major species here are assessed, so we know their status. And the allowable biological catches are set under the Magnuson-Stevens Act with binding scientific review by those of us on the North Pacific SSC. We know from 2 slides ago that no groundfish stocks in this region are overfished or subject to overfishing. Okay. We do know that when environmental shocks have affected Pacific cod, fishing effort was curtailed. Okay, so management was able to react. There are some interactions with this fishery and king or Chinook salmon and halibut in the form of prohibited species catch. So prohibited species catch is bycatch that they're not allowed to land and market, and that they are supposed to avoid at all levels of total catch. But there are caps that limit incidental catch mortality from this fishery. We take some care of the ecosystem through a 2 million metric ton ecosystem harvest cap. And this is designed to mitigate the trophic effects of very high volume fishing. In fact, most years, the allowable biological catches in this fishery are much higher than 2 million metric tons. and the council sets total allowable catches for the fleets that are less than the fisheries could sustain. And this is a fishery that, especially being high latitude, we're really starting to see some of the effects of climate change. And we're working on how to respond to that. Okay. So with this background here and our notions of biological and ecosystem success, let me just sort of a kind of show of hands here. Who thinks this is a fabulously successful fishery? Okay. This is a reasonable, successful fishery management effort. Kind of ambivalent about it. Who thinks this is not very successful, but there's some bright spots? Thinks this is not successful at all. Okay. All right, we kind of look around. We're feeling pretty good about the biological success of this fishery. I think that makes some sense. So let's turn our attention to some other notions of success. We'll talk about human outcomes. Fishing, and focus here on economics. Fishing is important because it provides employment and livelihoods. So this is why fishing is important to people, or one way that fishing is important to people. And this is true both in the harvesting sector and in processing and trading fish. And a sustainable harvest requires that the businesses that do the harvesting and do the processing and the trading are able to make enough money to stay in business. And this is reflected in National Standard 5 under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which holds that conservation and management measures shall, where practicable, consider efficiency in the utilization of fishery resources. Okay, so here we're saying we're allowed to, we're encouraged to, we're required to regulate in a way that makes for profitable fisheries, except that no such measure shall have economic allocation as its sole purpose. We can't just take fish from some people and give it to somebody else. So, what are some of the economic contributions globally? Fisheries provide about 171 million tons of food. This is a combination of fisheries and aquaculture, worth about $362 billion a year. We employ about 67.5 million people, and about a third of that is in aquaculture. It constitutes almost 20% of animal protein and feeds about 3.2 billion people. And in low-income developing countries, particularly coastal states, fish can be a very high share of the protein that's available to them. So why are we concerned about economic performance? Fisheries and fish resources, because an unregulated resource can be claimed by anyone, are subject to overexploitation and, separate from that, low profits. So that we can both have a biological tragedy of the commons and an economic one. So in open access, new harvesters can enter a profitable fishery until there's so much effort that stocks are driven down and the amount of catch that's left for each harvester is unprofitable. Now, if we implement some basic regulations like prohibiting new harvesters, right, a limited entry program, the harvesters who are incumbent can still fish and invest more in fishing to compete more effectively with one another. And that takes resources, takes profits away from the fishery. And that competition drives down profits even when you don't have people making money, and can also further depress stocks. Now, if we come in with a total allowable catch where we limit the amount that is harvested, harvesters can still invest in their operations to catch fish faster before that total allowable catch number is met. And that depletes profits. So in general, we think that we economists argue that allocating quota for either groups or individuals provides incentives to minimize cost and maximize quality. And when you're trying to harvest the highest quality fish and land it and get it to the markets who are willing to pay the most for it, and you're doing so at the lowest cost, this is where you're going to have the most profitable fishery. So what sort of metrics do we use to measure economic performance? And here we're going to look again at the ground fish, the BSAI ground fish. And every year we publish an economic fishery status document that we call a SAFE. And in that, we have a dashboard of metrics that tell us how we're performing and how that's changed over time. So to give you a sense here of what we actually look at to determine whether we're being successful, our first metric is revenue. How much fish do we sell? Our second metric is price. What kind of prices are we getting? Our third metric is where do we fit into the world, right? Alaska's effective share of global catch. Our third metric is the ex-vessel share of first wholesale revenue. So this is what percentage of the wholesale sale goes back to the vessel. So this is the division between the harvesting sector and the processing sector. So we care about that distribution. And then we have the real wholesale value divided by fishing weeks, which is a measure of cost. So we're interested in what's our return per unit cost. Now, one of the things that we try to do in fisheries is, one of the things that we try to do to improve economic performance is see that seafood and fish is getting to its highest value market. That is, we're finding the people who value it most. And here we measure and monitor the amount of trade that occurs. And I love this graph that's put out by, or this poster that's put out by Rabobank, that shows us the origin of seafood, both wild capture and aquaculture, and where that goes. And one of the takeaways on this graph is that seafood is one of the most traded food commodities. So where seafood is caught is not caught or grown, is not where it's eaten. And the reason for that is the markets are trying to help the fisheries get the highest value and maximize economic performance. So this is one of the things that we can keep track of to monitor our economic success. Now, economic success is linked and considered alongside community success. Here, fishing provides financial and cultural foundations for engaged communities. And the way this is articulated within Magnuson-Stevens is in National Standard 8. And it says that conservation and management measures shall, consistent with the conservation requirements of this act, take into account the importance of fishery resources to fishing communities by utilizing economic and social data in order to provide for the sustained participation of such communities and, to the extent practicable, minimize adverse economic impacts on such communities. So this, in our word cloud, I think, is where we were trying to capture well-being of fisher, happy fishers, and stable jobs. So how do we measure community outcomes? Here we have some metrics in the groundfish economics safe, where we look at the proportion of revenues that are coming to Alaska relative to the rest of relative to operations that are based out of the rest of the country, mostly here in Seattle. And we have another sort of status informational document that we call a SIPO. It is the Annual Community Engagement and Participation Overview, which is a new data product that the council is using to look at various community aspects. And here we are breaking out things like landings tax revenue by individual communities, okay? And seeing how those change over time. We also have engagement indices where we try to identify how important individual communities are to the fishery. All right, so the engagement index is an indicator of the degree of participation in a community relative to the participation of all other communities that fish in Alaska. So this is a quantitative tool that we are using that's based on pounds landed and revenue by resident vessel owners in each community, the number of active vessels registered in each community, the number of unique vessel owners in each community. And by community, we are tracking over time the level of engagement in harvesting and the level of engagement in processing. And you can see there are a few communities that really stand out, right? So Seattle here has values of 8 against values of 1 in many other communities that you usually think of as being heavily engaged in the groundfish fishery. Unalaska Dutch Harbor has very high processing engagement relative to other communities. So this is sort of how we keep track of which communities are engaged and how intensively are they engaged. Now, I've been trying to think about, I have for a number of years, been trying to think about how to assess performance along the triple bottom lines. And a couple colleagues and I developed this tool called the fishery performance indicators. What I was showing you is a very data intensive method to assess progress. And the requirement that assessing progress and tracking progress rely on generating a lot of data is something that would make it very hard to know where we stand in much of the world. As we saw in the map of the world from the RAM Legacy database, in half the world, we don't actually know very much at all about the status of fisheries. So what we did is develop a rapid assessment instrument that's designed to measure the generation of benefits from fishery resources so that we may assess whether or not the current fishery management regime is being successful. And our goal here is to identify key points for designing, improving, refining management strategies. So our measure here develops a numerical economic indicator, a numerical community performance indicator, and a numerical ecological indicator. And these 3 are outcomes. But in addition to measuring outcomes, we also measure enabling factors separately. And these are factors that are sort of conjectured to support what might happen, or what might conjectured to support higher levels of performance on these outcomes. So This is a horrendogram. It is too small. I don't expect you to be able to read that from there. Our projector is not that good. But I want to show you the sorts of things that we measure and say, what do we mean? What do we look at when we're trying to understand success? We look at a large number of metrics, and each of these metrics is scored on a Likert scale between 1 to 5. And this is an example where we're looking at how much money do crew make? Do crew make good earnings relative to their community? So here we have a 5 is crew who make sort of more than 50% more than a typical wage in their community. A 1 is people who make less than half. A 3 is people who are about average, and 2s and 4s are in between there. And it's been our experience and our intent here that these 1 to 5 Likert scale categories make it possible to accurately scale in the absence of precise data when we don't have the ability to go survey crew on how much money they make, or a great effort. And we're going to allow the person doing our scoring to identify the best information source or proxy data. And we encourage our scorers to provide a confidence or quality grade. How confident are you that this number is correct? So what are the things that we look at when we try to think about success and performance in economics? So we look at harvest. How much fish is landed? How long is the season? Is there a lot of excess capacity in the fleet? We look at harvest assets. Are people spending a lot of money to catch relatively little fish, or are they using inexpensive technology and catching a lot of fish? Are they taking out big, expensive loans? Is it hard for them to get loans that look like loans a normal business person would get? We look at risk. How much do things vary during the year? How much do things vary across space? How much do things vary, price and landings vary over time? We look at trade. Are fish products getting to the primary, the markets that are willing to pay the most for them? We look at product form. Are people getting the most value from the harvested biomass? And we look at product form. I'm sorry, I just said that. And we look at the harvest sector and what sort of capital and loans do they have. For community, we look at the returns that managers, processing owners, and captains make. We look at crew and processing workers. We look at health and sanitation and community services. And we look at who owns the capital to go into the fishery, and do people think of fishing as a career? Pass on that. Yes, what are some of the trade-offs among these triple bottom line pillars? We found that often in global, especially fishery management context, people talk as if there's a trade-off or a balance to be struck among resource health and profit. We can have lots of fish now or profit now, but not both. So we conducted we have a database that at the time we wrote this paper had 121 case studies in it. And we looked at the correlation in these, and we found, this is correlative, not causative, or not causal, but high levels of ecology performance are correlated with high levels of economic performance. There's not a trade-off there at all. Further, high levels of community performance are associated with high levels of ecological performance. And economics and community are also positively correlated. And these correlations are stronger with fishing rights. Now, so far we've talked about how it's important to think about fisheries as our notion of community and economic performance have been sort of rooted in a developed country, healthy economy perspective. When we're dealing with vulnerable populations, success is also going to consider the potential to alleviate or provide resilience against extreme poverty and starvation. This is predominantly in a small-scale fishing context. And here there are some competing perspectives on how to manage small-scale fisheries. One, sort of articulated in this paper by Chris Bene and others, is what's come to be known as the welfare model, where people in need of food or money due to a crop failure, seasonal unemployment, temporary unemployment, can go and fish and get food or get some money that week. And in contrast, we have the wealth model, which has been outlined by Cunningham et al., where they say a well-managed and profitable fishery creates profits and high-earning jobs that can be distributed and support activities and job creation in other sectors of the local economy. And there's a new report out that has done some really innovative work identifying the contributions of small-scale fisheries. And it is identified that small-scale fisheries provide subsistence for 52.8 million people, right? So this is kind of the welfare contribution. And employment for 60.2 million people. That's about 94% of total employment in fishing, small-scale fishers. And that's kind of the wealth model of fishing. So we have this question out there that is something I'm kind of interested in, or I'm very interested in doing more research on and sort of kicking off some projects on. When do you manage for welfare and when do you manage for wealth? And the challenge here is that limiting access is sort of required to create profits. But if you limit access, then people who have short-term needs for money or food can't go to the river and take the fish. Let's see where I am for time. So let's talk about the economic and community success of our BSAI groundfish. The first few bullets here repeat what I had on the previous slide, just as a reminder. But what I want to draw your attention to is that the large fleets here have quota and cooperatives. And their intention there is to mitigate the competition for fish and focus on cost minimization, yield, and product quality. And as a result, these fisheries have been very successful in competitive and domestic and foreign markets. They're able to coordinate their salmon and halibut incidental catch avoidance, and they have steady revenue streams, good prices for their product forms, and are generally considered profitable. There are, however, interactions with coastal Alaska communities. Most of the harvest capital, revenue, and employment is associated with Seattle. However, there is a contribution to coastal Alaska communities because 10% of the harvest quota for most of these fish species is allocated to Alaska community or community development quota groups that they use and reinvest in local infrastructure around fishing. And the king salmon avoidance incentive plans minimize mortality, and halibut PSC, prohibited species catch limits, constrain halibut mortality. So there's some give and take here in this fishery. Let me hit on this last notion of success. And this, to be perfectly honest, is an area that I'm still learning about. And I have questions about. And is the notion of governance success. When do you have a successful governance process? And the idea here is that successful management is conducted through an equitable process that should be able to adapt and reflect new information and conditions that change over time. Why? There's good ethical reasons that we should have an equitable governance process. We want to respect human rights to development. People should be able to self-actualize with well-being, increase their well-being, have dignity. There's also an instrumental case for this. Inclusive governance improves the quality of policy because people bring in information and bring in ideas about how to manage things. It also improves legitimacy and compliance. And there's sort of four components to this. Distribution of costs and benefits. This is largely the economic and community benefits that we've been talking about. Who experiences the costs and benefits? But we also talk about procedure. How inclusiveness is the decision making? How inclusive is the decision making? And recognition. How do we recognize the validity of, or how do we recognize who stakeholders are and who can contribute to and participate in the process? And all of this occurs within a context where there are conditions that influence the actor's ability to gain recognition and make claims that benefits. All right. There's some dimensions of these equitable process attributes. You see here what recognition means: human rights, customary property rights, different identities. Procedure means that everyone who's relevant can participate in decision making. There's transparency, accountability. Distribution, we pay attention to who gets the costs and benefits, and enabling conditions, which include legal, political, and social recognition, and an adaptive and learning approach. And finally, it's important to recognize that processes for decision-making are political. They attract rent seekers, people who just want to get a piece of the pie because a piece of the pie is being distributed. They may not have legitimate claims. So there are frameworks here, and here's one that I found, that talk about who sort of has a legitimate claim to being a stakeholder and be included in the process, right? People have high levels of interest, high levels of influence, who are significantly impacted, can make decisions that will impact the process, who are close by, who have an economic interest, who have historic rights or legal rights, who have who will view the process as fair or unfair if they are not informed about it. People who are members of underrepresented or underserved populations. These authors advise, Sharp advises, that in different policy processes, you can have different thresholds. But an effective process is going to allow groups to be able to make claims and demonstrate that they have a level of interest, or they have an economic interest, or they have rights, and to establish those so that they can participate as full stakeholders. So what does this mean for how we do science? First, to recognize that political decision makers use science, what we do, as one input. And in some cases, science produces binding results, such as allowable biological catches under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. But often, like the social and economic data I presented, these are just informational about policy impacts. And this complements public testimony, traditional lobbying, in ways that as ways that people can assert claims. And procedural equity here involves being represented in the science, not just in the politics. And to achieve procedural equity, we use approaches like co-creation of science, peer learning networks, inclusion of inductive and traditional knowledge approaches, which are complementary to Western science. And recognition and contextual equity involves centering other processes, such as traditional rights and governance systems. And a lot of these approaches are very highly contextualized to specific applications. And I'm not aware of any metrics or dashboards that monitor this yet. I would love to learn of some. Just some examples in our groundfish application, and I'll try to hit on these. And I have selected these to make them fodder for conversation after the seminar. Okay. So I would say that the Magnuson-Stevens Act council process facilitates new claims and refinement of the measures. For example, some environmental NGOs claimed that trawling damaged hard corals on the shelf, shelf edge canyons. And the council supported cooperative research to show there were no hard corals there. Some Alaska Native communities on the Yukon and Kuskokwim claim that king salmon mortality was driving low returns of king salmon to subsistence rivers. An analysis suggested most of the Chinook that were caught as bycatch don't come from those rivers, and many of those that are caught are very unlikely to make, or only about 2% of them would survive to return. So this was a small effect. Let's see. The shoreside Pacific cod processors claimed they were harmed by a new cod trawl quota program. So the council gave them 22.5% of the harvest quota. We have a new claim by Yukon and Kuskokwim communities that chum salmon bycatch is driving low returns in subsistence rivers. And these claims have been supported by a new to the council local knowledge, traditional knowledge process. And we're designing further research on the links between low returns and the fishery and the federal groundfish fishery. Within all this, Alaska Native communities do express some frustration with inclusion in the council process because meetings are difficult and expensive to get to. There are uncertain ways to include traditional knowledge within the scientific process. And the council, though the council has developed some new local knowledge and traditional knowledge on-ramps. Right? So there's some things to think about as we go forward there. So let me wrap up. Management and policy can be evaluated in many different ways. Perspectives include biological, economic, social, community, and governance processes. And different groups are going to emphasize different perspectives on the same policy. To me, measurement is critical. We have to operationalize objectives and definitions of success. It's important to develop metrics. So we have concurrence on what is important to stakeholder groups to facilitate planning, negotiation, compromise. And it's an important step in identifying a theory of change for new policy and fishery investment projects. And we can touch on Peter Drucker's quote, "Only what gets measured gets managed." We measure something, we track it, and we can manage it. And it's hard to do that for things we don't pay enough attention to measure. And then let me leave you with some big thoughts. This is the last slide. What is the role of your definition of success? I've asked you this a couple of times, right? But we're scientists. We are not stakeholders in most of these processes. We use our expertise to support, monitor, and facilitate stakeholders in achieving their goals. Okay. One perspective. Our notions of success are probably biased to focus on our expertise and be especially sympathetic to the stakeholders with whom we work. And something I kept returning to as I think about this problem, as I was advocating for this as a theme, as I put this talk together, is success an attainable ideal? Right? So there are some things which are the Socratic or Platonic ideal, where we work toward them, but never quite get there. So can we ever actually say that we are successful when there's probably always something we can do to improve one of our measures and move or make our processes more equitable or effective? Okay, I will stop there and say thank you very much. Got a couple minutes, take a couple questions, and then allow for vigorous debate, as I know I'm standing between you and a beer.
I think that's the definition of success. 2 points. One, I've always defined success as not failure. So if you think about it as not failure, it's a little easier to think of progressive improvement. And I can give you lots of examples of failure. But I wanted your thought in the governance area on this idea of science being binding. And that is a unique feature of the US federal system. Every other region I'm in, scientists love it. And every other stakeholder thinks that it gives scientists a unique perspective, not as the stakeholders, but as decision makers.
So the empirical way to answer that question is to look at the places where science is not binding, but where there are opportunities for other inputs and influences on that process, right? Certainly in the US, we saw when we implemented the science is binding change to Magnuson, we saw a pretty dramatic, pretty rapid recovery in a number of our keystone stocks, because we did have some stocks, particularly in New England, where I was at the time, so I'll claim a little bit of authority there, where political influences were overwhelming science and causing failure. One could argue that the European system, which was similar to what's going on, where there are political influences and political processes that follow scientific advice, was not terribly successful. So I think that there is evidence that on the biological side, a strong influence, whether it has to be firmly binding or not, I don't know, but a strong influence of science is important to achieve notions of biological success. What I'm less familiar with, the statement I'm more hesitant to make because I don't really know, is how that then is traded off against these other notions of success.
Chris, thank you for stimulating interesting book. I'm really interested in the concept, the changing concept of community, particularly in these large-scale fisheries, because participation is so broad and so complex and constantly changing. For example, a lot of the labor that participates in at sea or shore-based processing comes from all over the world, and in fact might be viewed to some extent as a welfare dimension. Poverty in a lot of countries. So how do you deal with this sort of changing baseline of how we think of it?
I don't have a simple answer. I'll tell you a couple things that I think about when I try to answer that question myself. Okay. One thing that I think about is how tied are those people to the fishery itself, right? So to me, you have a stronger claim on being a member of a community when you are strongly associated with that community. And if you are simply doing physical labor, and you would be equally happy doing a different type of physical labor, right? Then your link to the fishery is not as strong, right? So when we talk about using migrant labor in processing plants, for example, that's tied in with a much broader notion of other places that we use migrant labor, which includes on farms, in people who clean houses, and it is, I think about that differently, and think that they should that those jobs should figure differently in our notion of what's successful for a fishery than for people who are strongly tied to the fishery itself. Does that begin to respond to your
Yeah, I
question?
think that's a part of waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
Just a curious question.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned throughout your presentation, you said that management is critical. So a couple of slides back when you're talking about like governance success, you mentioned that when groups like make certain claims about like the harvesting practices of like fish, and their effect on like communities, like how often will a governing body actually check up on the claim before making like a policy change? Do they just they check every time, or is it something that, you know, depending on the severity of the claim, they actually do some research into that?
So just for example, and I don't mind leaving you here. Are these the kinds of claims you were talking about? The slide you had in mind? So the context of these claims is that people are approaching the council seeking some sort of policy change, right? So whenever there's an amendment to the groundfish FMP here, there's sort of a requirement that there be some analysis, which could be either very rigorous or not rigorous at all, to sort of document the extent of these claims. Now, it is a substitute for the rigorous scientific documentation of the claim to just politically lobby. But in theory, in every one of these cases, there is an opportunity, there's a pathway which these groups used to approach the council and get on the council agenda and get their issue discussed and analyzed, right? Now, I think some of the concerns that are expressed down here are that there are other issues that some groups would like to bring forward to the council, but they're not, have not been successful at getting on the agenda, getting those ideas discussed, getting official proposals that would support or that would address or remedy those claims. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. You wanna
Take previous one.
Oh, we'll take previous and then yeah.
There was an article in the paper a few days ago about one or more fisheries companies in Seattle cutting staff and reducing their programs. That was in Seattle Times.
This is in the Seattle Times. Trident's doing that, and they're divesting from some of their Alaska processing plants. So yeah, yes, there are some changes underway there, and Trident's been a little
close to the vest about what changes exactly they're going to make. And the communities in which a lot of those plants are located, we don't really know what the disposition is going to be. We know in the past, the council has attempted to develop set-asides and prop up those set-asides of fish to be landed at particular plants in order to prop up communities when there's a sort of community-supported effort to operate a processing plant. But those rural Alaska is a tough place to process fish and get it to market. So will that be successful? I don't know.
All right, there's a reception outside, so you didn't have your opportunity to ask Chris a question. Chase him down, and let's thank him one more time.